All right, so this is a lecture on limiting pesticide use, and this is action number 4 of ways that we can prevent the decline of populations of birds or minimize it. And I am recording from being out of town from my sister's house in Ithaca, New York. Let's go on to the next slide. My working outline, I'm going to harken back to Rachel Carson a little bit, remind us about DDT. Then I'll talk about the direct impacts that pesticides have on birds. Then following that, the indirect effects that pesticides have on birds. That would be mostly by destroying their prey, as well as the vegetation that the birds live in. And then I'll follow up on pesticides used at home, the rodenticide used around campus buildings, and solutions that we can kill off our pests a little bit and also keep our birds. So a little bit of compromise. All right, so first of all, I hope you understand that I'm not anti-pesticide. There are plenty of good uses for pesticides, one of which is the fact that our agricultural system and food production depends on pesticides. We need food, we need good health, and so 70% of global food production has increased by 70% due to the use of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. So first of all, herbicides is against plants, kills off weeds. Insecticides kills insects. Fungicides kills fungus. And nematicides kill off a kind of animal called a nematode worm. All right, so these things again help with food production. They help with human health by killing off pests that cause us harm. And so we need them, but we need to be more careful with them to protect the birds. So you'll remember Silent Spring. This was Rachel Carson's book. In several of her chapters, she discussed DDT, the pesticide that kills off insects such as mosquitoes. And that is no longer an issue anymore because it was outlawed. But there are still many pesticides that are used today that have the same problems. They are spread over agricultural fields and they travel large distances. The wind, I should say, the wind will carry them outside of the farmers' fields and into other natural areas. The rain will wash these pesticides off into the streams and lakes and rivers. And then, of course, even if it's not transported by wind or water, it'll get into the soil and it's going to remain there in the soil for a good long time. Now, something I mentioned in previous lectures, bioaccumulation. This is where the animal, let's say a bird, ingests an insect that contained the pesticide. Then that pesticide is stored in the bird's body, usually in its fatty tissues, and its fat. And fat is used as fuel, and so eventually the bird is going to burn through that fat and be exposed to those chemicals. Biomagnification happens in the higher predators because it's not just eating one insect that was exposed to pesticide, but it's eating many insects that were exposed to pesticide. And then maybe you've got a predator of that bird, maybe a raptor, that eats those birds. And each of those birds was exposed to pesticides through its diet. So the effect is magnified because any single dose of the pesticide through eating a few bugs that are affected, that's not enough really to kill or harm a bird, but in a higher predator, it's exposed to higher amounts of the pesticide just because those effects are kind of accumulating throughout its diet. So I say pesticide concentrations are higher in those Higher on the food chain, that's talking about predators. And in our class, we're talking about bird predators like hawks and owls. Now, it might, if it is in the bird's body, it can kill them outright. But more than likely, it's going to have a sublethal effect. It's going to reduce natural behaviors like reproduction and looking for food, and it's going to impact organ function. So the bird doesn't, it's sickly, and maybe it doesn't live as long. Well, so that was sort of a review. Let's consider the effects of the pesticide on birds through the things that they eat. So I'm going to talk about insecticides, the chemicals that kill off pest insects. There is a well-known phenomenon that people my age are familiar with, and that is when you're driving your car down an interstate. Let's say you take a road trip. I'm at my sister's house right now studying raptors at Cornell for this week, and I drove 6 hours from my home in Greensburg to get here. Well, after a 6-hour trip in the car, going at highway speeds on highways, if this was 20 years ago, my windshield would be filled with splattered bugs, moths, insects, just bugs, right? The flying insects. Your car is going through the air, it's splattering things on the windshield. So it used to be that was true. You go for a 6-hour ride, you've got to clean your windshield off at the end. You've got to pull into a gas station, get the squeegee, and clean off the windshield. I barely see anybody use the squeegees anymore. It used to be that I had to use a squeegee every time I fueled up, but that is no longer. Now, that's great for me because I never liked to clean off the windshield. That was gross. But it really does suggest that our insect populations have drastically declined in the last 20 to 30 years. And that's just kind of an anecdotal story about how I've noticed that there's fewer insects. There are plenty of scientific studies looking at insect populations, and some of them find drastic decreases, some of them not so much, but overall it's really hard to study insect populations because there's usually a month-to-month cycle in their populations. Insects don't last, they don't live very long, so it's sometimes they're going to be more at a higher population than others. They're weather dependent. And of course, it depends on like the season and where you are in the world. So I just got some figures here showing you kind of the data is all over the place. And some insects are studied more than others, and that's that top graph in letter A. There's a lot more studies. Like 80,000 studies on one kind of insect. At the top, I can barely make that out on my screen. I think that's the Lepidoptera, which are like butterflies and moths. And then there's far, far fewer, much closer to zero numbers of studies on some, less interesting, less beautiful, less common insects. Because people like to study butterflies. They're pretty. So we just don't know actually whether the insect populations are decreasing in all of these kinds of insects, although we suspect that they are. All right, so in fact, here's a review of studies. I went and found a few different authors. That's the table in the column on the right, author and year. And then I just kind of summarized their papers. So sometimes they're looking at flying insects. In Germany, they found a decline of 76% over 27 years. There's some that are finding a decline of 1% per year. Of course, that's what's called a death by 1,000 cuts. If it's just 1% decline per year, you're not going to notice it. You and I aren't going to notice it. But again, over 20 years, you realize you don't have to clean your car's windshield anymore. And that's what we're finding throughout Western Europe and North America. Other European studies, United States studies, world studies are listed there on the table. And it's all showing pretty drastic decreases in insects. And again, none of us like to be eaten by mosquitoes, but our very existence, the food chain, is dependent on insects, not just birds, but everybody. And so this is a cause for concern. Here's the data from one particular study, and it shows the kinds of insects that are being affected. We've got, you'll see the red and the green and that's the light blue there in panel A. If you see a tall red bar, that means that most of those kinds of insects are decreasing. And very few green is showing up there in the graph. So hardly anything is increasing in number. So the columns are labeled Ornithoptera, Odontia, Lepidoptera, Hymenoptera. I don't expect you to know what all those kinds of insects are, but the author has tried to show you kind of the kinds of insects they are. The Lepidoptera, again, you got the picture of the butterfly there. Odonta are like, dragonflies, crane flies, things like that. And then there's like ants and beetles and things. And again, most of them have this red decreasing over time. The panel on the right is by how much they are decreasing. And the darker the color means more than 40% decrease over the last 40 years. And that's kind of across the board. Bad stuff. All right, now, can we blame pesticides or insecticides on all of this decline of insects? No, we can't. There's a whole variety of factors associated with insect declines, and that's shown in that pie chart. We've got the largest pie slice, about 24%. That's just due to intensive agriculture. And that's not specific to pesticides. But the second largest slice there on the pie, that is pesticides. That's the directly killing off of the insects that we don't really want, but we still need. Kind of an ethical dilemma there. There is a special kind of insecticide called the neonicotinoid. This is the most widely used chemical in agriculture, and it has a wide-ranging, in other words, it affects a wide range of insects. And the reason it does is because it attacks their nervous systems. All insects have some neurons, not exactly a brain, but a little brain area that controls its function. And this chemical goes in there and turns it off. It's rather rapidly kills them off. And it affects all insects because all insects have a nervous system. So there are plenty of beneficial insects, the pollinators, for instance, that are affected by these chemicals. Almost all corn and most soybeans planted in the United States are coated with these chemicals. So you have the seeds, they've put this chemical and it sticks to the seed, and that way as the seed germinates, the little baby plant is absorbing that chemical into its tissues so that it is resistant to being eaten by pests. And so it gets through the whole plant, the roots, the shoots, the flowers, the fruits, Everything about that plant is now contains this pesticide, and if an insect begins to eat the vegetation or eat the fruit or the seed or the pollen, they are killed. The graphic on the right of this slide shows how easily the neonicotinoids are spread throughout the environment, again through wind, as it's being applied by the equipment, or by water runoff, or just getting into the soil. And it's affecting our pollinators, affecting the earthworms that are in the now, worms are not exactly the insects, but it's going to affect earthworms as well, and it's going to poison everything in the soil. Helps us grow our plants, but it kills off a lot of the important invertebrates that we need as well. Okay, I'm going to transition now a little bit to talking about herbicides. Herbicides, remember, kill off plants, like weeds that you don't want growing in your garden, for instance, or weeds that you don't want growing in your agricultural fields, or weeds that are here growing in a like a power line cut. So, they've installed a power line, it goes from point A to point B. You don't want the trees growing up and falling over and causing power outages, and so the power companies will clear the land every once in a while of large vegetation, and then once that's done, they will spray it. Maybe not every year, but frequently it's every year. They spray it through aerial application. Helicopter comes through. And just kills off all the vegetation there so that you don't have vegetation growing up and interfering with the power lines. Another area where you might see pesticides would be just along the roadside. And I'll see this. St. Vincent Drive is a state highway that goes past campus. And late in the summer, I'll see that the vegetation along each side of the road has been sort of burned. It's all brown and shriveled, and that's because someone has driven a piece of equipment that just kind of sprays that chemical along the roadside. Why would they do that? Well, it helps maintain the roadside so that they don't have to mow the shoulder. That maybe is a safety thing where, if you've got vegetation growing up right up against the road, then, you don't have very good visibility anymore. So it's kind of a shortcut. It's easier to spray pesticide, probably cheaper than it is to go in there and physically cut it down. So that's another example, again, of pesticides. Here's my slide about this. Herbicides, as their name implies, only kills plants. So why am I talking about this in a lecture on birds? Well, it's because it's killing off the vegetation, which means that there's less vegetation for the birds to use, less vegetation for their habitat structures where they build their nests. And it's also less vegetation where they can feel protected from predators, and it is also less vegetation to supply the insects that the birds eat with the food that the insects need to eat. Again, it's part of the food chain, and these pesticides are impacting the food chain at multiple levels. So even though there's no direct mortality of herbicides on birds, it still has a negative impact on bird populations. Well, you and I don't have that much control over whether the power company is spraying, a power line cut, or the gas company, a gas line cut, or the highway department spraying the roads. But we do have some, a little bit more impact on whether we use pesticides in our home or garden setting. And some surveys have been done, and about a third of home gardeners employ pesticides. That would be flower gardens or vegetable gardens. And of those, most people are using a chemical called glyphosate, which is sold under the trade name Roundup. Roundup is cheap to make, and it's pretty harmless for mammals. And so people, I mean, it's marketed for use in people's yards because it doesn't have an impact on, dogs and cats and children. I mean, there's some debate about dosages and stuff. I mean, at a high level, it probably does have some health effects. There have been some court cases, for instance. But it certainly does kill a lot of weeds. They're called broadleaf weeds. Anything that is not a grass. A grass has a very narrow leaf. And so, yeah, that's real easy. If you want a nice lush lawn, you can spray this herbicide all over it, and you're killing anything that's not grass. And so, people will use it in their lawns as well. Many farmers will spray it because they will have specific corn and soybean plants that have been genetically developed or modified to not be killed off by this pesticide, whereas all the possible weeds in the fields, they are subject to the pesticides. So it's very commonly used in agricultural, like industrial agricultural settings. Here's a figure of some British people. 615 gardens were surveyed, and this again is where that figure, about 32% of gardeners uses the pesticide, and this figure will show you that it is impacting bird diversity as well. They looked and found that of those gardens that were using the herbicide, there were fewer birds in those gardens. So pretty direct link, if not a direct impact on the birds. All right, I will gonna end here for a moment, and I'm gonna come back later and finish recording.